Rising. So rising is probably, in my opinion, one of the most important, if not the most important, technical strength.
One of the most popular arm wrestling lifts in recent times has no doubt been the wrist rise lift, popularized by Devon Larratt. And it's quite easy to see why it's so popular. It's simple, doesn't require much equipment, and the numbers you can get on it are extremely humbling. Which is especially entertaining when you get someone who's never done the lift before to try it. But more importantly than all of that, no matter what your arm wrestling philosophy is, it's hard to argue against the fact that wrist rise is an extremely important arm wrestling fundamental, especially if you're a top roller, as I've covered before in the previous video. But there's one question that a lot of people don't think about when it comes to rising, and that is how rising works. The answer is actually surprisingly simple.
It's simple.
And in this video, I'm going to explain to you very simply how this important arm wrestling fundamental works biomechanically, and related to that, also why a lot of people find it hard to improve their rising. And first, to approach this question, I'd like to go back to that popular rising lift that Devon introduced to most of the arm wrestling community. It's a static lift, with the radial deviation, aka rising component of the wrist, completely engaged, aka locked.
Saddle up! Lock and load!
The loop of the belt can be placed between the first and second knuckles, though more recently, Devon has been promoting doing it over the first set of knuckles instead.
Should be directly, the middle part of the belt should be directly on the knuckle. Because I think that this is the most vital part of the rise.
But whatever the case may be, the lift is said to be successful as long as radial deviation is maintained, aka the wrist does not drop. So, this is a very simple lift, and for most people, it can continue to produce gains for a significant amount of time. But there is not much in terms of range of motion for this lift. And in fact, many people don't even encourage training radial deviation in a dynamic manner because of the high risk of injury if you go too heavy. And this is a very fair argument. I think that because of how weak this movement is, it is indeed very easy to accidentally overdo yourself and get injured. Even a 1 kilogram weight jump can be the difference between executing the lift seemingly easy and not being able to lift the weight at all. And for those of you who watched my previous video on hypertrophy, you might know where I'm going with this whole focus on static lifting. Without a way to train the muscles involved in a dynamic manner, you limit their growth potential, and as a result, you limit the strength potential gains for your riser. But if we're not allowed to train this rising lift dynamically, then you may ask, how else are we supposed to train this with a good range of motion? The answer lies in understanding how rising works. What most people don't know is, rising isn't exactly a straightforward movement per se, in the same way you would imagine something like your elbow flexors curling in your arm. That is because unlike hinge joints like your fingers, elbows, and knees for example, the wrist is what we call a condyloid joint. This is a type of modified ball and socket joint like your shoulder, which allows instead for a movement in 2 dimensions compared to the shoulder's 3 dimensions. How radial deviation works is the muscles called the flexor carpi radialis and extensor carpi radialis, which are one of your wrist flexors and wrist extensors, work together to cancel out the flexion and extension, and instead they just pull the wrist upwards toward the radial side. And I'm willing to bet for 99.99% of arm wrestlers, wrist flexion is not gonna be an issue. Almost all of us, I'm sure, train wrist flexion a lot. But also, I'm very sure that a big number of us, comparatively, neglect training wrist extension. Even though wrist extension is a weaker movement than wrist flexion, it is by no means a negligible amount of assistance, especially so for a lift where most people struggle to hit even 60 pounds. Because wrist flexion works in tandem with wrist extension to create rising, it is extremely important to train your extension precisely because your wrist flexion is unlikely to be the limiting factor out of these pairs of muscles. Strength reasons aside, it is also important for health reasons. A lot of injuries arise because of muscle imbalances. Common muscle imbalance injuries people suffer from, such as lower back or knee pain, are thought to be generally caused by weaknesses in muscles somewhere along the movement chain, like in the hips or the quads, for example. And for arm wrestling, the wrist is possibly one of the most likely places where muscle imbalances can occur, given how much we focus on wrist flexion or cupping. Back to a more direct benefit. There are also subtle arm wrestling techniques that involve kicking back the wrist. Check out this short but informative video by Tom Stubblebine on what I'm referring to.
Kicking your own wrist back, and the purpose of doing wrist kickback is in order to engage your pronation and keep someone out of a hook.
And obviously, if you get stronger in wrist extension, getting stronger in such a move is just going to be a natural byproduct of that training. So, after listing out all these reasons on why training wrist extension is good for you, especially for your rising, I want to know, how many of you out there before watching this video actually spent a decent amount of time training your wrist extension? And also, I'd like to know, what are some of your favorite wrist extension exercises? Personally, looking online, there are already a ton of wrist flexion videos and specialized handles for cupping on top of that. But it's pretty much the opposite when you come looking for wrist extension videos or handles. So a lot of my wrist extension training I've had to come up with myself. So please, let me know your guys' thoughts and experiences in the comments section below. I'm Greg, and I'll see you guys in the next one.